The crystal chandeliers of Maison Laveau cast fractured light across tables dressed in cream silk, turning the New Orleans restaurant into a cathedral of excess. Dimitri Cale occupied the corner booth like a king on a throne, his charcoal suit tailored so precisely it seemed painted onto his broad shoulders. The scar along his jawline, a souvenir from his climb to power, caught the candlelight when he smiled, which he did often, but never with warmth. His laughter rolled across the dining room, deep and territorial, drowning out the soft jazz quartet playing near the bar. 4 men sat with him, their suits almost as expensive, their postures almost as confident, and their eyes almost as cold. Almost. But everyone in Maison Laveau understood hierarchy. Dimitri didn't just command the table, he commanded the oxygen around it. Outside, the French Quarter pulsed with its usual Friday night chaos, tourists stumbling between bars, street musicians competing for attention, the humid air thick enough to taste. Inside, wealth insulated diners from all of that, creating a bubble where consequence seemed optional and power was the only currency that mattered. Dimitri lifted his glass of Pappy Van Winkle, the 23-year, because ordering anything less would suggest weakness, and the men at his table mirrored the gesture with practiced synchronization. They were celebrating another acquisition, another business that had folded rather than face the alternative. The owner had signed everything over that afternoon, his hands shaking so badly the pen had skittered across the paper like a wounded insect. "To expansion," Dmitri announced, his accent carrying traces of his grandfather's Odessa origins beneath the Louisiana drawl he'd adopted like camouflage. The words weren't toast, they were verdict and promise wrapped together. The servers moved through the restaurant with practiced invisibility, appearing when needed, vanishing when not. Dmitri barely registered them as human, more like well-trained automatons that brought food and removed plates according to some internal programming he neither understood nor cared to. She appeared at his table without warning, pitcher in hand, pouring with steady precision that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Dimitri's first impression was dismissive, mid-30s, pulled-back hair the color of dark honey, simple black uniform that hung slightly loose on her frame. Her face was unremarkable, or would have been, if not for the stillness in it. She didn't smile the desperate, please tip well smile he was used to. She didn't make eye contact seeking approval or fearing rejection. She simply poured water and prepared to leave. "You're new," he said, not because he cared, but because he could. Because making someone acknowledge his attention was another form of power, and power was the only thing that truly interested him. She paused. The pitcher held steady despite the interruption. "First week, sir." Her voice was quiet, measured, carrying no inflection that might suggest personality or opinion. The perfect server voice, deferential without being obsequious, present without being intrusive. Something about that restraint irritated him, maybe because it suggested she was performing rather than genuinely diminished by his presence. Whatever the reason, Dmitri felt a small flame of annoyance kindle in his chest. "What happened to Marcus?" he demanded, referring to his usual server. "He called in sick, sir. I'm covering his section tonight." She set the pitcher down, her movements economical and precise. No wasted motion, no nervous energy. One of Dimitri's companions, Nikolai, who'd been drinking since lunch, leaned forward with aggressive friendliness. "You're pretty enough. Smile more, though. Customers like that." His grin was wet and presumptuous. The woman's expression didn't change. She simply retrieved the empty appetizer plates from their table, stacking them against her forearm. "I'll bring your entrees shortly," she said, already turning away. Hey. Dimitri's voice carried command that stopped her mid-step. She turned back, waiting. My friend paid you a compliment. Least you could do is acknowledge it. For just a moment, so brief Dimitri almost missed it, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, which he would have recognized immediately. Not even anger. Something colder, more calculating, like she was measuring him against some internal standard and finding him wanting. Then it vanished, replaced by careful neutrality. My apologies, she said, the words themselves appropriate but carrying no actual apology in their delivery. I'll remember that. She left before he could respond, disappearing through the kitchen doors with the plates balanced perfectly. Dimitri watched her go, feeling strange dissatisfaction settle in his stomach. The exchange had been minor, meaningless even, but it left him feeling like he'd lost something without understanding what or how. The entrees arrived 20 minutes later, carried by the same server whose name Dimitri still hadn't bothered to learn. She distributed plates with professional efficiency, his blackened redfish positioned exactly as he preferred, Nikolai's ribeye bleeding appropriately rare, each dish placed with precision. Dimitri cut into his fish, the flesh flaking perfectly under his fork. Around them, other diners conducted their own small dramas, a proposal in progress near the window, an older couple arguing in whispers over wine. The restaurant hummed with the sounds of commerce and celebration. More bread, Dimitri said without looking up, the command directed at the air itself. The server appeared moments later, basket in hand, placing it within his reach before stepping back. That subservience should have satisfied him. Instead, it felt performative, like she was playing a role rather than actually diminished by his presence. The distinction bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. Nikolai, emboldened by another glass of bourbon, decided to push boundaries. You work out? He asked the server, his eyes making a slow journey from her face downward. You're built pretty solid for a woman. Athletic. I like that. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to drop several decibels. The server's hands, one holding the empty breadbasket, the other at her side, curled into loose fists. Not tight enough to signal aggression, but prepared, coiled, ready for something. I stay active, she said carefully, each word measured. Is there anything else you need? Dimitri should have let it go, should have waved her away and returned to his meal. But Nikolai's crude attention had put her on display, and displays demanded audience participation. What kind of active? Dimitri asked, his tone casual but carrying an edge. Yoga? Pilates? One of those boutique fitness things where rich women pretend they're athletes? He saw it then, just for a microsecond. Her jaw tightened fractionally before she forced it back into composure. CrossFit, actually, she said, when I have time. One of Dimitri's other companions, Marco, who fancied himself a gym enthusiast, laughed with particular cruelty. CrossFit? Jesus, those people are cultists. All that grunting and dropping weights, acting like they're training for war when they're really just taking Instagram photos. The server's eyes flickered toward Marco, something cold passing through them, then returned to neutrality. Everyone needs a hobby, she said quietly. Hobby? Dimitri tested the word. That's one way to describe it. I'd call it compensating. People who weren't good enough to be real athletes, pretending that showing up to a gym makes them special. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, watching her over the rim. What were you, before this? Failed personal trainer? Couldn't cut it in the real fitness world, so you're slinging plates instead? The restaurant had gone genuinely quiet now, conversations dying at surrounding tables, as people sensed the shift from casual dining to something more predatory. The jazz quartet finished their song and didn't immediately start another. She stood perfectly still, the empty bread basket held against her midsection like a shield. For a long moment she didn't respond at all, and Dmitri felt victory beginning to settle into his bones. Then she spoke, her voice somehow quieter than before, but carrying through the silence with perfect clarity. "I'll bring your dessert menus." She turned to leave, and Dmitri felt that dissatisfaction surge back, stronger now. She hadn't broken, hadn't fought back or collapsed, or even shown proper fear. Just absorbed his mockery like it was weather, unpleasant but temporary. "Wait," he called after her, the command sharper than intended. When she stopped and turned back, he gestured at her uniform with his fork. "You've got a stain. Right there." He pointed to a spot on her chest that was spotless. "Sloppy. If you can't keep yourself presentable, maybe CrossFit isn't the only thing you're failing at." His companions laughed, the sound forced but present, men performing loyalty to power by participating in its cruelties. Other diners looked away. The servers near the kitchen doors stood frozen. The woman looked down at her uniform, scanning the fabric where he'd pointed. Found nothing, because there was nothing. Looked back up at him with an expression that should have been blank, but somehow managed to convey entire encyclopedias of contempt without changing a single feature. "I'll get that cleaned right away, sir," she said, her tone so neutral it wrapped back around to being its own form of violence. Then she walked away, her stride measured and unhurried, disappearing through the kitchen doors without looking back. Dimitri's companions immediately launched into congratulations, calling him savage and hilarious. But Dimitri barely heard them, his attention still fixed on those kitchen doors, wondering why a victory felt so much like he'd just made a critical miscalculation. Across the dining room, a young man at a corner table had pulled out his phone, his face going pale as he stared at the screen. His date leaned over to see what had captured his attention, and her expression shifted from curiosity to shock. She looked up, her eyes finding the woman who'd just been humiliated, then back down at the phone. The young man stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor loud enough to draw attention. He was moving toward the kitchen when the doors swung open and the server emerged carrying dessert menus. "Holy shit," the young man said, loud enough that half the restaurant heard him clearly. "You're Vera Solis." The name hung in the air like a bomb whose timer everyone could hear counting down. Vera Solis. 2 syllables that transform the entire atmosphere of Maison Laveau from predatory entertainment to something else entirely. The server, Vera, paused mid-step, her body language shifting subtly, shoulders squaring incrementally, chin rising a fraction, weight redistributing in a way that suggested roots growing down through the floor into bedrock that couldn't be moved. The sheep costume she'd been wearing began to peel away. "I'm working," she said simply, her voice still soft but carrying a different quality now. Not submission, but authority. She'd been moderating her presence before, dampening herself down. Now she was simply present, and the space she occupied suddenly felt larger. The young man with the phone was practically vibrating with excitement. "That's Vera Solis, the Vera Solis, 3-time world champion. Undefeated in professional kickboxing for 7 years. They called her the Silent Storm because she never talked trash, but absolutely destroyed people in the ring. She's a legend." Around the restaurant, phones emerged from pockets and purses as other diners began searching. Screens glowed in the dim lighting, faces illuminated as people scrolled through images and articles, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to dawning horror. Dmitri sat frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth, his mind racing to catch up with a reality that had shifted dramatically. Vera Solis, three-time world champion, undefeated for 7 years. The words ricocheted through his skull, each one a hammer blow. Nikolai had gone pale, his bourbon glass forgotten. Marco had his phone out, frantically searching, his face growing progressively more alarmed. The other men at the table were silent, carefully reassessing a situation they'd badly misjudged. "I didn't recognize you without the young man gestured vaguely at his own face. "The intensity. You're so different in person. Quieter." Vera set the dessert menus down on a nearby table, then turned to face him fully. "People are often surprised by that," she said. "Fighting isn't my personality, it's my profession." "Was my profession," she corrected, a shadow passing across her features. "Why are you working here?" The question burst from the young man with the tactlessness of genuine confusion. "You made millions. You were ranked #2 pound-for-pound fighter in the world." Vera's jaw tightened. That same tiny tell Dmitri had noticed earlier, but this time he understood what it meant. She was holding back something enormous. "Life happens," she said simply, "and bills don't pay themselves. Now if you'll excuse me, I have tables to serve." She picked up the menus and moved to deliver them, her stride carrying a different weight now, not the careful invisibility of a server trying not to be noticed, but the measured confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous she was and chose restraint over demonstration. The young man turned to his date, speaking in an excited whisper that nevertheless carried, "Do you understand what we just watched? That guy just spent 10 minutes insulting someone who could literally kill him with her bare hands. She's on record breaking concrete blocks with her shins. She knocked out a woman in Sao Paulo with one kick. She's probably the most dangerous person in this entire building, and he was treating her like she was nothing." Dmitri felt eyes turning toward his table, dozens of gazes that carried judgment he wasn't accustomed to receiving. His phone buzzed against his chest. He pulled it out to find a text from his younger brother. "Dude, you're trending on Twitter." "What the fuck did you do?" "Trending." Dmitri opened Twitter with fingers that wanted to shake, scrolling until he found it. A video, already with 40,000 views and climbing rapidly. Someone had filmed the entire exchange. The caption read, "Mafia boss humiliates server not knowing she's world champion fighter Vera Solis. The ending is." He watched himself on screen, saw his own smugness and casual cruelty immortalized in high definition. Saw Vera's restraint, her careful responses, that the camera showed clearly weren't submission, but monumental self-discipline. Saw the moment the young man recognized her and the way Dimitri's face went slack with realization. The comments were brutal. "Imagine mocking someone who could literally murder you and choosing not to." The restraint it must have taken her not to correct his face. "This man really called a world champion a failed athlete. I'm dying." Dmitri set his phone down with trembling hands. His appetite vanished. His triumph curdled into something toxic. Around him, his companions dealt with their own phones, their own versions of viral shame. Vera emerged from the kitchen carrying their dessert menus, her approach slower than before, more deliberate. When she reached their table, she set the menus down with precise movements, her hands steady despite the dozens of phones now openly filming her. Then she looked at Dmitri, really looked at him, her eyes meeting his with direct, unflinching assessment that he couldn't hold. He looked away first, and in that breaking of eye contact, something fundamental shifted. I have thick skin, Vera said quietly, her voice pitched for their table alone, though in the tense silence it carried farther. Comes with the territory. You spend years having people literally try to break your face. Words stop meaning much. But here's what I learned in the ring that applies everywhere else. The strongest fighters aren't the ones who hurt people because they can. They're the ones who could hurt people but choose not to. That's real strength. Real power. She let the words settle. The opposite. Hurting people who can't hurt you back. That's not power. That's just cowardice wearing a designer suit. Then she walked away, leaving the dessert menus and taking with her every shred of authority Dmitri had entered the restaurant possessing. He sat in the wreckage of his own making, in a restaurant full of people who just watched him get dismantled by someone he'd dismissed as nothing. His phone buzzed again. Another text. Boss, that video's everywhere. People are calling you Hank's silent storm survivor. Might want to lay low for a while. Dmitri stood abruptly, throwing cash on the table. Far too much. The desperate gesture of someone trying to reassert dominance. We're leaving, he announced to his companions, his voice lacking its usual command. As they moved toward the exit, Dmitri caught one final glimpse of Vera. She was at a table by the window, refilling water glasses with the same precision she'd shown all night, her face serene despite the chaos. She looked up as he passed, and for just a moment their eyes met again. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, simply looked at him with an expression that somehow managed to convey both disappointment and understanding, like she'd expected exactly this kind of behavior, but had hoped for better anyway. Behind him, someone in the restaurant started clapping. Then another person. Then more. Until the entire dining room filled with applause for a server who'd absorbed cruelty with grace and taught a lesson without throwing a single punch. Outside, standing beside his car, Dmitri could still hear that applause echoing through the thick night air. And for the first time since he'd clawed his way to power through violence and intimidation, he wondered if maybe there were forces in the world that couldn't be dominated through fear alone. Forces like the woman in a server's uniform who'd just dismantled his empire with nothing but restraint, dignity, and two sentences that would haunt him for a very long time. The penthouse suite overlooking the Mississippi had cost Dmitri $8 million, but tonight its floor-to-ceiling windows felt like a cage made of glass. He stood in the darkness, refusing to turn on lights, nursing bourbon that tasted like ash and regret. Below, the city sparkled with oblivious life while his own unraveled in viral infamy. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. The video had surpassed 2 million views now, spawning think pieces and commentary videos, turning his humiliation into content for a world that consumed schadenfreude like oxygen. But it wasn't the public shame that kept him at this window at 2 a.m. It was the way Vera Solis had looked at him in those final seconds, that expression of disappointed understanding that had cut deeper than any insult could have. Dmitri pressed his forehead against the cool glass, the bourbon making memories surface that he usually kept buried. He saw himself at 14, standing in the guidance counselor's office at the school on the poor side of Metairie, wearing clothes that didn't fit right because they were his cousin's hand-me-downs. The counselor had explained, with performative patience, why Dmitri couldn't take advanced placement classes despite his test scores. Students from his background often struggled with rigorous coursework. Better to stay where he could succeed. The unspoken message was clear. Poor kids from immigrant families didn't belong in rooms with children of doctors and lawyers. He'd felt then what Vera must have felt tonight. The helpless rage of being judged by someone who'd decided your worth before you'd even opened your mouth. The difference was, at 14, Dmitri had no power to fight back. But he'd made a promise to himself that day. He would never be looked down on again. He would accumulate so much power that no one could ever make him feel small. He would become the person others feared to disrespect. And he had. Through intelligence and ruthlessness and willingness to do things others wouldn't, he'd clawed his way out of poverty into empire. He'd built walls so high that no one could ever look down on him again. Except tonight, a woman in a server's uniform had done exactly that. Not by looking down, but by looking through. By seeing past his tailored suit and dangerous reputation to the insecure boy still desperate to prove he mattered. And worse, she'd done it with pity, rather than fear. The bourbon glass was empty again. Dmitri stared at it, wondering when exactly he'd become the thing he'd once hated. When had he turned from the kid fighting not to be dismissed into the man dismissing others? His phone screen glowed with a notification. His mother calling. He let it go to voicemail, not ready to hear the disappointment he knew would be in her voice. She'd raised him better than this. She'd scrubbed floors in hotels while studying English at night, had taught him that dignity wasn't about how much money you had, but how you treated people who had less. "We were poor, Dima," she'd told him countless times in Russian. "But we were never cruel. Don't forget the difference." He'd forgotten. Or more accurately, he'd decided the difference didn't matter once you had enough power to make people fear crossing you. Vera Solis had just proven every one of those assumptions catastrophically wrong. She possessed more actual power in her pinky finger than he'd accumulated in 20 years, and she'd used none of it. Had absorbed his mockery with restraint that demonstrated strength he couldn't comprehend. That was power. Real power. The kind that didn't require performance or demonstration because it was so fundamental it couldn't be questioned. Everything he'd built suddenly felt like a child's crude drawing next to a masterpiece. Technically functional, but spiritually hollow, achieving the shape of power without capturing its essence. Dmitri turned from the window, the room spinning slightly from bourbon and exhaustion and a fundamental shift in how he understood the world. Tomorrow, he would deal with the fallout. Tonight, he would sit with the uncomfortable truth that the strongest person he'd encountered in years had been wearing a uniform he'd barely noticed, carrying burdens he'd mocked, demonstrating grace he couldn't imagine achieving. And she'd done all of that without breaking the man who'd tried to break her, which meant she was better than him in ways that money and muscle could never measure. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of hangover that felt moral as much as physical. The video had reached 8 million views now, earned him a new nickname trending on 3 platforms. Ego destroyed. He sat at his home office desk, staring at his computer screen where he'd pulled up everything he could find about Maison Laveau. His first instinct was to make a grand gesture, send flowers, a cash gift, maybe even buy her a car. But even through his hungover fog, some part of him recognized that approach would be worse than doing nothing. His phone buzzed with a call from Vincent. "You need to come to the warehouse. We've got a situation with the Thibodeau shipment." "Give me an hour," Dmitri said. But first, before the warehouse, he had something to do. Maison Laveau didn't open until 5 on Saturdays, but Dmitri knew restaurant timing. Staff would be there by 2 for prep work. He arrived at 2:30, parking a block away, because showing up in a Maserati suddenly felt like another thing to be embarrassed about. The service door in the alley stood propped open for deliveries. Through it, he could hear kitchen sounds, the hiss of something frying, Spanish and English mixing in shouted coordination. He knocked on the door frame. A young prep cook looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to poorly concealed alarm. "Mr. Kyle, we're not open yet, sir? I'm looking for Vera Solis. Is she working today?" The prep cook's face did complicated things. I don't think she'd want to see you, sir. Respectfully. I understand that, but I need to apologize. In person. The prep cook wavered, then disappeared into the kitchen. Dimitri waited in the alley until a different figure appeared in the doorway. Chef Laurent, the restaurant's owner, a third-generation Creole whose family had been feeding New Orleans for decades. He was a small man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen everything the city could offer and remained unimpressed. "Monsieur Kyle." His accent was thick, his tone arctic. "You have considerable nerve showing your face here." "I know. I need to speak with Vera. I want to apologize. She doesn't work here anymore." Laurent delivered the information like a verdict. "Quit this morning. Couldn't face coming back after that video went viral overnight. Reporters already trying to reach her through us. Social media people wanting statements. Your little display turned her life into a circus." The words hit Dimitri like physical blows. She'd lost her job. Because of him. "I'll compensate her. Lost wages, whatever. She doesn't want your money." Laurent's contempt was palpable. "You think cash fixes this? You humiliated a woman who survived things you can't imagine. Then the world made you pay for it. And now you want to throw money at the problem. That's not how apologies work." "Then tell me how they work." Laurent studied him for a long moment. "Figure out why you thought it was acceptable to treat another human being like that in the first place. Fix whatever's broken in you that made cruelty feel powerful. That's your work, not hers. She doesn't owe you forgiveness." He stepped back into the kitchen, then paused. "For what it's worth, she said something before she left. Said she hoped you'd learn something from this. Said maybe getting knocked down would be good for you. Help you remember what being on the bottom feels like." The door closed, leaving Dimitri alone in the alley with those words echoing. She'd hoped he'd learn something. Even after everything, she'd extended him more grace than he'd shown her. He stood there for several minutes before walking back to his car. The warehouse situation would have to wait. He had research to do. The thing about the internet was its unforgiving memory. Dimitri had both search terms and patience, along with a growing obsession that felt less like curiosity and more like penance. Vera Solis, the silent storm. Her Wikipedia page was impressive. Born in Albuquerque to a single mother who'd worked 3 jobs, started training in Taekwondo at 8 because it was offered free at the community center. Switched to kickboxing at 15, won her first amateur championship at 17. Turned professional at 19 because her mother had gotten sick and insurance didn't cover experimental treatments. Dimitri clicked through to an interview from 5 years ago. The journalist had asked about her nickname. "I'm not performing," Vera had said. "When I'm in the ring, I'm working. I don't need to convince anyone I'm dangerous by talking about it. They'll find out soon enough." She'd smiled then, briefly. "My mother used to say the loudest dog in the yard is usually the most scared. Real threats don't announce themselves." Dimitri watched 17 different fights, seeing the same pattern repeated. Vera giving respect even when opponents hadn't earned it, demonstrating that strength and grace weren't mutually exclusive. In her championship bout against Katya Volkov, a Russian fighter known for aggressive cruelty, Vera had absorbed insults during the weigh-in with neutral expression. Then in the ring, she'd systematically dismantled Volkov with technical precision. After the knockout, when Volkov had struggled to stand, Vera had been the first person at her side, helping her up, supporting her weight, and speaking softly in Russian. You fought well? Be proud. The deeper Dmitri dug, the more tension gathered in his shoulders. Here was a woman who'd built a career on disciplined violence, who possessed skills that made her genuinely dangerous, and she'd used none of it when he'd provided every justification. He found articles about her retirement 2 years ago, but financial websites told a different story. Her mother's experimental treatments had worked initially, then the cancer had returned. Vera had spent her last 2 years of earnings on care that insurance deemed not medically necessary. Her mother had died 16 months ago. Vera had fought twice after that, winning both matches but with visible damage. Then she'd retired abruptly. The truth was brutal. Medical debt had consumed her savings. Her mother's final 6 months of care had cost over $300,000. Financial websites showed liens against her, debt collection agencies circling. She'd lost everything saving someone she loved, and she'd done it without public complaint or crowdfunding campaigns. Just worked quietly, paid what she owed, and survived with the same disciplined grace she'd shown in every other aspect of her life. Dmitri sat back in his chair as afternoon became evening, staring at a photograph from Vera's final fight. Her face was bloodied, lip split, left eye swelling shut, but her expression remained serene, a warrior at peace with violence because violence had never been the point. He'd mocked her for working in a restaurant, had called her a failed athlete, suggested she was compensating. She'd absorbed his cruelty without breaking, had shown him mercy he absolutely didn't deserve, and then lost her job because his viral humiliation had made her life untenable. The guilt was physical, a weight pressing down on his chest. But beneath the guilt, something else was forming. Determination that felt different from his usual approach to problems. He couldn't buy his way out of this, couldn't intimidate it into resolution. If he wanted to make amends, real amends, he'd have to do it the way Vera did everything. Without fanfare, systematically, with patience and genuine commitment rather than flashy demonstrations. His phone buzzed with another message from Vincent about the warehouse. Dmitri ignored it, opening instead a private browser window and beginning new research. Medical debt relief programs, debt consolidation services, ways to anonymously settle accounts without the debtor knowing who'd paid. Real strength required no announcement. The most powerful actions happened in silence, without audience or applause. Just one person choosing to do the right thing because it was right, not because anyone was watching. He could learn that. He would learn that. Starting now. 3 days of research had transformed Dimitri's understanding of Vera Solis from surface-level facts to intimate knowledge of a life built on discipline and sacrifice. But facts on screens weren't enough. He needed to understand the texture of her current reality. Vincent sat across from Dimitri's desk, confusion evident in his weathered face. You want me to follow her? I want you to understand her situation, Dmitri corrected. Where she's living, what her daily routine looks like. But carefully, Vincent. She can't know anyone's watching. Vincent's expression suggested he thought his boss had suffered some kind of psychological break. You got it. Anything specific? Everything. She's got medical debt from her mother's treatments. I need exact amounts, account numbers, who holds what. Also her current living situation, whether she's working anywhere else. This about making amends for the restaurant thing? I'm not throwing money at anything, Dmitri said. She lost her job because of me. The least I can do is understand what that actually cost her. Vincent nodded, something shifting in his expression that might have been respect. I'll be discreet. Give me 2 days. After Vincent left, Dmitri returned to his screens, diving deeper into aspects of Vera's life that painted an increasingly devastating picture. Property tax liens on a small house in Gentilly, a lawsuit from a physical therapy clinic claiming unpaid bills from Vera's own injury treatments. Court documents revealed she'd been making payment arrangements, honoring commitments despite having no visible income source beyond restaurant work. She'd been juggling everything with disciplined precision, keeping all the balls in the air through sheer force of will. Then Dimitri's viral video had made her too recognizable to work in public-facing service jobs. He found her social media accounts, barely used, last posts from 3 years ago. Her Instagram showed training photos and motivational quotes, professional content required by sponsorships. No selfies, no personal life, no vulnerability. "She's like a ghost," Dmitri muttered, scrolling through the absence of digital footprint. His phone rang. Vincent, earlier than expected. "Found something you need to know about," Vincent said. "She's been training someone. Kid from the 9th Ward. Teenager who got mixed up with the wrong crew. Vera's been working with her for free, 3 mornings a week at a gym in Trem, trying to channel her into competitive fighting instead of street violence." Awareness settled over Dmitri like a weight. Of course she was. Of course, even while drowning in debt and working double shifts, Vera Solis was still finding ways to help someone else who needed it. "The kid's good, apparently," Vincent continued. "Gym owner says she's got natural talent, and Vera's been teaching her discipline, composure. She's not charging anything, turned down offers to pay. Says she's just passing forward what someone did for her once." The information settled into Dimitri's growing understanding of exactly how badly he'd misjudged this woman. She wasn't broken or diminished. She was rebuilding, methodically, using whatever resources she had left to create meaning from loss. "Keep digging," Dimitri said. "I want to know everything about her debt situation by tomorrow. And Vincent? Make sure she never knows we're looking." After they hung up, Dmitri sat in the darkening office, thinking about the teenager Vera was training. Thinking about the choice to give time and expertise to someone who couldn't pay, who might never become champion, who simply needed someone to believe they were worth investing in. His mother had done something similar once, taught him chess in their cramped apartment, devoted hours to showing him strategy when she was exhausted from work. "Smart beats strong," she'd told him in Russian, "but kind beats both. Remember that, Dima." He'd remembered the first part, built an empire on intelligence and strategy, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten the second part entirely. Vera Solis was proving him catastrophically wrong. She was stronger than anyone he'd ever met, and her strength came precisely from the compassion he'd dismissed as irrelevant. His phone buzzed with a message from one of his legitimate businesses. Dmitri ignored it, opening instead a new document and beginning to outline a plan that would need to be executed with the same precision Vera brought to everything. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back words captured and distributed to millions, but he could build something better in the present, could use his considerable resources to quietly repair damage and create space for her to thrive without ever knowing his hand was involved. It would require patience he'd never needed to develop, humility he'd spent decades trying to destroy, and a complete reimagining of what power actually meant when wielded correctly. But if a woman could survive championship violence, career-ending injuries, crushing debt, and his public mockery while still finding time to train a teenager for free, then surely he could manage to act with basic human decency for once in his life. The conference room on the top floor of Dimitri's legitimate holdings felt different when used for this purpose. Vincent stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand. Next to him sat Simone Leclerc, a lawyer who handled the legal side of Dimitri's business. "Let me make sure I understand," Simone said slowly. "You want to settle someone's debts anonymously. Not as leverage, not as investment. Just pay them off and disappear." "Correct," Dimitri confirmed. "There are ways. Debt buyers purchase debt portfolios at discount. If you create a shell company, purchase her specific debts as part of a larger portfolio, then forgive those debts as business decisions. It would appear normal." "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "You want this done correctly, not quickly." Dimitri nodded, accepting the timeline. Patience, discipline. Vincent cleared his throat. "What about the job situation?" "She was studying sports medicine before her mother got sick," Simone said, reading from her tablet. "Had 2 years toward a degree. If she went back, finished the program, she could work with athletes in a capacity that uses her knowledge." "How do we make that happen without it being obvious?" Dimitri asked. Simone smiled. "Universities have emergency funds for returning adult students. We could establish an endowment at Tulane specifically for former athletes continuing their education. Make it competitive, legitimate selection criteria. She'd have to apply and qualify on merit." "She'd still need living expenses," Vincent pointed out. "Stipends are normal for degree programs," Simone said. "If the endowment included living expenses, it wouldn't raise questions." They spent the next hour working through details: shell companies, documentation, and timelines. Simone took notes, offering suggestions that made everything more legally sound. By the time they finished, the whiteboard showed an intricate flowchart that would take months to implement but would ultimately eliminate Vera's debt, create educational opportunities, and establish funding mechanisms that others could also access. "This is going to cost approximately $3 million over 5 years," Simone said. Dimitri didn't hesitate. "Do it. Set up the endowment with $5 million. Better to have excess than run short." $5 million for someone who served you dinner one time," Vincent said slowly. $5 million because I have it to spare and she doesn't deserve to suffer because medical care in this country bankrupts people. And because I contributed to making her life worse when I could have just kept my mouth shut." Simone and Vincent exchanged glances. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. Neither spoke, but something in the room's atmosphere had shifted. "There's one more thing," Dimitri said. "The teenager she's training. Find out what that kid needs. Set up another fund, youth athletic development. Make sure that girl has everything required to succeed. If Vera can find time to invest in one kid's future while her own life is falling apart, the least I can do is make sure that investment pays off." "Getting soft, boss," Vincent said, but his tone carried approval. "No, just learning the difference between strength and cruelty. Took me 43 years in public humiliation, but better late than never." Simone closed her tablet. "You know she might still refuse, might be too proud to accept help." "I know. But that's her choice to make. All I can do is create the opportunity. That's how respect actually works. You offer without demanding." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Start the paperwork. I want the debt purchasing company established by next week, the endowment announced within a month. Keep me updated on everything, but keep my name out of everything." After they left, Dimitri remained in the conference room, staring at the whiteboard covered in numbers that represented a fundamentally different use of power than he'd ever contemplated. It felt strange, uncomfortable, like learning to write with his non-dominant hand, but somehow more honest than the easy cruelty he'd perfected over decades. 6 weeks after the viral video, Vera Solis received an envelope that changed everything. Inside was a letter from Acadian Debt Solutions informing her that her medical debt portfolio had been acquired and subsequently forgiven. The remaining balance, $287,000, had been reduced to zero. She read it 3 times, sitting in her car outside the mid-city apartment complex, where she'd been renting a studio for $800 a month. The letter felt surreal, like a scam. But the account numbers matched. When she called, a professional representative confirmed everything. Her debt had been purchased by Acadian, forgiven under their charitable program, reported to credit bureaus as paid in full. "Is this real?" she'd asked, her voice barely steady. "There's no catch?" "It's real, Ms. Solis. Consider it handled." She sat in her car for 20 minutes after hanging up, trying to process the impossible weight that had just been lifted. The debt had been crushing her for 18 months. Now it was just gone. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, this one from Tulane University. The Carson Athletic Legacy Endowment was accepting applications from former competitive athletes wishing to complete degrees in sports medicine or related fields. Full tuition, books, and living stipend for qualified candidates. Vera almost threw it away, assuming it was mass marketing. But something made her read to the end, where the eligibility criteria seemed almost written specifically for her. Prior competitive achievement, demonstrated financial need, career interrupted by injury or family circumstances. She applied on a Friday night, filling out forms that asked about her fighting career, her mother's medical situation, and her current circumstances. The essay question asked what she hoped to accomplish. She wrote about understanding injury from both sides and how that perspective might help athletes navigate professional sports without losing themselves. 3 weeks later, she received an acceptance letter. She'd been selected as one of the first recipients, effective the following semester. Classes would begin in January. The timing was impossible, perfect, suspicious even. But Vera had learned through years of fighting that sometimes you didn't question good fortune. You just accepted it and moved forward. She chose to believe the universe occasionally paid attention because the alternative was drowning in suspicion. She picked up her phone and typed a response to the invitation. "I accept. Thank you." January brought cold rain and new beginnings. Vera walked onto Tulane's campus feeling simultaneously ancient and newborn, a 34-year-old surrounded by 20-year-olds who'd never had to choose between rent and medical care. Her classes were challenging in unexpected ways. The material wasn't difficult. She'd lived anatomy in her body for decades, but returning to student life required adjusting to different rhythms. Her professors recognized her, approached with careful respect to express appreciation for her presence. Dr. Martine Chen, who taught sports psychology, asked her to guest lecture about comeback training. Vera delivered a talk about the ego death that came with retirement, about rebuilding identity when the thing that defined you was gone. The students listened with unusual attention, several approaching afterward to share their own stories. In March, she started working with Tulane's sports medicine department as an athletic training assistant. The job provided both income and practical experience with athletes recovering from injury, bringing patients that came from having been there herself. Meanwhile, at the Trem gym, where Vera still trained the teenager from the 9th Ward 3 mornings a week, equipment had started appearing. New heavy bags, quality gloves. The gym owner explained it vaguely, something about a youth athletic development grant from an anonymous donor. The teenager, Keisha, who'd been headed toward gang involvement, had thrived under the structure. She'd won her first amateur bout in February, dominating with technical precision Vera had taught her. After the fight, Keisha had found Vera in the corner, tears streaming, thanking her for believing. "I was heading nowhere," Keisha had said. "You gave me somewhere to aim." "You gave yourself that," Vera had corrected. "I just showed you the direction." By April, Vera had established new rhythms: school, training sessions with Keisha, her job at the athletic department. She wasn't wealthy, would probably never be wealthy again, but she was stable. The constant panic about bills had receded. One evening in late April, running as the sun set over the Mississippi, Vera's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline caught her attention. Dimitri Kale announces major charitable initiatives, credits wake-up call for changed priorities. She stopped, breathing heavily, and opened the article. It detailed how Kale had established multiple programs: debt relief for medical crisis survivors, athletic endowments for former athletes, youth development funding. The article included a quote: "I spent years believing power meant domination. Someone taught me, through patience I didn't deserve, that real strength is restraint. These programs are attempts to embody that lesson. Someone taught me." Vera read those words 3 times, complicated emotions rising and tangling. Was he talking about her? The timing was suspicious. Programs launched around the time she'd started receiving help. The debt relief company, the endowment, the youth grants funding Keisha's training. She stood on the levee, watching the river flow past with ancient indifference, trying to decide how she felt. Part of her wanted to be angry. She hadn't asked for his help. But a larger part recognized that the help had been given without strings, structured to preserve her dignity. If it was him, and she increasingly believed it was, he'd learned something from that night. Had taken the lesson she'd tried to teach and actually applied it. That was rare. Most people who demonstrated cruelty didn't transform, but sometimes, apparently, someone got knocked down hard enough that they actually reconsidered their foundation. Vera resumed running, turning the complicated mixture over in her mind. She didn't owe him anything, but she could acknowledge that growth was possible, that people who did wrong could learn to do better. The sunset painted the river in shades of copper and flame. Tomorrow she'd wake early, train Keisha, attend lectures, and work with injured athletes. She'd continue building a life that mattered. And if a man who'd mocked her had learned something about actual power through watching her refuse to fight back, well, that was its own form of victory. Less visible than knockouts, but no less definitive. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, 5 months into Vera's return to academic life. The sender was listed as TCL Foundation, Tulane Carson Legacy. The subject line read, "Year-end Donor Recognition Event. Your attendance requested." Vera almost deleted it, assuming it was about a fundraising event where students would be paraded in front of wealthy donors. But something made her open it. The email explained that the Carson Legacy Endowment was hosting a small gathering for its first cohort of recipients to meet the program's founding donors. Attendance optional but encouraged. June 15th, 7 p.m., Garden District, the founding donors. Plural, but Vera's instincts were pinging. She pulled up the endowment's website and began reading more carefully. The Carson Legacy Foundation had been established 8 months ago, 3 weeks after her viral encounter with Dimitri Kale. Its mission focused on supporting former competitive athletes pursuing degrees where they could mentor future generations. The founding donation had been $5 million from an anonymous source. Vera opened a new browser tab and searched for Acadian Debt Solutions. Their website showed a portfolio of debt relief programs targeting medical crisis survivors. The company had been established 9 months ago by a holding corporation that... She clicked deeper, following the corporate structure through layers of LLC registrations. After 20 minutes of digging, she found it. Acadian Debt Solutions was ultimately owned by Kale Holdings Group. Her medical debt had been forgiven by Dimitri Kale's company. Vera sat back from her laptop, breathing carefully through the surge of emotions. Anger, certainly. She hadn't asked for his help. But beneath the anger, grudging respect that he'd structured everything to preserve her dignity, that he'd helped without demanding gratitude. She spent the next 3 hours researching, confirming what her instincts had concluded. Dimitri Kale had methodically dismantled the financial crisis crushing her, had created opportunities that let her rebuild on her own terms, had funded programs that helped dozens of others while specifically addressing her situation. The Youth Athletic Development Grants funding Keisha's training, Kale Holdings, the equipment at the Trem Gym, purchased through his shell companies. Even her part-time position at Tulane, she followed the funding trail and discovered the position had been created through an endowment that traced back to the same charitable trust. He'd been helping her for 8 months, and she'd never known. Or more accurately, she'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm, because confirmation would complicate the clean narrative of rebuilding through her own efforts. But that narrative had been false. She'd had help. Substantial, carefully structured help. The question was what to do with that knowledge. She could ignore the donor recognition event, maintain distance. That would be easiest. But Vera had spent her life refusing to take easy paths when harder ones taught better lessons. The June 15th event was 3 days away. She had 3 days to decide whether to confront the man who'd humiliated her publicly, then spent 8 months trying to make amends privately. That night, unable to sleep, Vera pulled up the viral video. 8 months later, with 15 million views, it still made her stomach clench. But she watched the entire video, including the ending she'd never seen, the moment when recognition dawned. The way Dimitri's face had collapsed, the applause that had followed her exit. One comment thread caught her attention. "I've seen Dimitri Kale in that restaurant 24 times. Always arrogant, always cruel to staff. But I saw him there 2 weeks ago, and he was different. Polite, tipped 50%. Actually thanked the server. People can change if they're given reason. Whatever that video did to him, I think it actually worked. People can change if they're given reason." Vera closed her laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the city outside her window. She'd spent 8 months rebuilding without acknowledging who'd helped make that possible. Maybe it was time to look the man in the eye and see if the change everyone claimed to observe was real or just better performance. She picked up her phone and typed a response to the invitation. "I'll be there." The Garden District mansion hosting the Carson Legacy event was exactly what Vera expected. Antebellum architecture restored to perfection. Gas lanterns flickering along walkways bordered by ancient oaks. She arrived in a simple navy dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion, her first new clothing purchase in 2 years that wasn't athletic gear. Inside, the gathering was smaller than anticipated. Maybe 20 people total, 10 scholarship recipients, various administrators, and a handful of donors talking near the bar. Vera accepted a glass of wine she didn't intend to drink and scanned the room. Dimitri Kale stood near the back, partially obscured by conversation between 2 professors. He wore a dark suit but somehow seemed diminished by it. Or maybe he'd simply lost some of the aggressive confidence that had made him seem larger. He was listening with genuine attention, not performing interest but actually engaged. Vera watched him for several minutes. The arrogant posture had softened. His hands remained mostly still. When he laughed at something, the sound was muted, lacking the dominance display she remembered. Then he turned, and his eyes found hers across the room. The impact was electric. Vera saw recognition, shame, something that might have been hope or fear mixing an expression he couldn't quite manage. He said something brief to the professors and began walking toward her, with steps that looked like a man approaching execution. Vera remained where she was, letting him come to her. Other people were starting to notice, conversations dropping. Dmitri stopped at conversational distance. "Ms. Solis," he said, formal, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Vera replied neutrally. Then I realized I had questions that couldn't be answered from a distance. "I'll answer anything you want to know." He said it simply, without defensiveness. "You deserve that and more." Vera took a slow sip. "Did you set this up? The debt relief, the endowment, all of it. Was it you?" "Yes." No hesitation. "The debt relief company, the educational endowment, the youth development programs, they all trace back to me. I spent 8 months trying to repair damage I caused." "Why?" Vera asked. "Guilt? Redemption?" Dimitri's jaw tightened. "All of those, initially. But it became something else over time. I watched your fights, read about your life, learned what you'd sacrificed and survived. You demonstrated strength I didn't know existed, and I mocked it because I was too ignorant to recognize what I was seeing. Helping others through programs you inspired, became about trying to embody even a fraction of what you showed me." "You mean restraint," Vera said. "The fact that I didn't knock your teeth out when I could have. I'm talking about dignity under pressure, about using power through restraint rather than demonstration, about being strong enough to absorb cruelty without returning it." His voice dropped. "You could have destroyed me physically. Instead, you did something harder. You let me destroy myself publicly, then gave me space to learn from it. That took strength I'll probably never possess." Vera studied his face, looking for performance, finding only exhaustion and what seemed like genuine transformation. "You humiliated me, made me lose my job, turned my life into spectacle." "I know." He didn't look away. "If I could undo it, I would. But I can't. All I can do is try to be better going forward. The programs aren't about buying your forgiveness. They're about becoming someone who doesn't need to be forgiven quite so desperately." Around them, the party had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, some with phones filming. Vera set her wine glass down with careful precision. "You want to know what I think? I think you learned a valuable lesson at my expense. I think you've used considerable resources to make yourself feel better about being publicly shamed. And I think—" She paused. "I think that's actually okay." Dimitri's expression shifted from resigned acceptance to confused hope. "What?" "People who do harm should make amends, not through apologies or grand gestures, but through sustained action that demonstrates actual change. You spent 8 months doing that. You structured everything to preserve my dignity, helped without demanding recognition, created programs that benefit others beyond just fixing what you broke. That's real accountability." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Dmitri said quickly. "Good. Because I'm not sure I'm offering it yet. Forgiveness isn't owed just because someone realizes they screwed up. But I can acknowledge growth. I can recognize that you learned something and actually applied it. That's rare enough to be worth noting." She stepped closer and extended her hand. Dmitri looked at it like it might be a trap, then grasped it carefully. "I'm going to make you a deal," Vera said, maintaining the handshake. "I won't publicly condemn you. Won't give interviews or leverage my story to make you pay beyond what you've already paid. In exchange, you continue these programs. You keep helping people. You use your resources to lift others instead of crushing them. You prove that this isn't temporary performance but actual transformation. I can do that, Dmitri said immediately. If you fail, if I find out you've reverted, I will make it my personal mission to ensure everyone knows your philanthropy was just expensive guilt management. Her grip tightened slightly. But if you succeed, if you genuinely become someone who wields power with restraint and compassion, then maybe eventually I'll be able to tell people you learned from your mistakes, that people really can change. She released his hand. Don't waste this opportunity. Be better. Not because I'm watching, but because it's the only version of yourself worth being. Dmitri nodded slowly, something like peace settling into his features. I will. I am. Thank you for seeing that possibility in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Vera turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. The teenager you've been funding? Keisha. She won the regional championship last month. She's applying to college now, first in her family. That's what your money bought. Not my forgiveness, but her future. Remember that when you're deciding whether to maintain these programs. She walked toward the exit and the room erupted in conversation. Vera heard someone start clapping, then others joining, but she didn't look back. She'd said what needed saying. Outside, the humid New Orleans night wrapped around her. She stood on the mansion's front steps, breathing deeply, feeling lighter. Not because she'd forgiven Dmitri Kale. She wasn't sure she ever would fully, but because she'd looked the man who'd hurt her in the eye and recognized that people could survive their own worst versions and build something better. Her phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. Coach V, just got accepted to LSU, full scholarship. We did it. Vera smiled, genuine joy breaking through. They had done it. She'd taught discipline. Keisha had applied it with fierce determination. And they'd both proven that the strongest thing you could do was refuse to let circumstances define your ceiling. She texted back, You did it. I just showed you the door. You walked through it. Proud of you, kid. Then she walked toward her car, heading home to a life she was rebuilding one disciplined choice at a time. In the months following the Garden District confrontation, the programs Dmitri had established expanded rapidly beyond his initial vision. By midsummer, the Carson Legacy Endowment supported 43 students across 5 universities. Acadian Debt Solutions had forgiven over $30 million in medical debt for 200 families. Youth athletic development grants had helped establish training programs in 8 cities. But more than the numbers, what had changed was Dmitri himself. He'd begun divesting from the criminal side of his operations, slowly, carefully. His legitimate businesses expanded while his illegitimate ones contracted. It would take years to complete the transition, but the direction was clear. Vincent had pulled him aside a month ago. Boss, some of the old crew are getting nervous. Good, Dmitri had replied. I want to lose that particular edge. And if they test you? Then I respond with precision rather than overkill. Show them I'm not weak, just choosing to direct strength differently. In late July, Dmitri stood backstage at a conference in Atlanta, more nervous than he'd been facing down rivals with guns, listening to Vera deliver her keynote address. Real strength, she was saying, isn't about domination. It's about knowing you could destroy and choosing not to. About absorbing damage without returning it. About maintaining dignity when the world gives you every excuse to lose it. The audience, sports medicine professionals, athletic trainers, coaches, listened with rapt attention. Behind Vera, images cycled through her career: championship victories, bloody battles, the moment she'd helped a knocked-out opponent stand. "I learned this lesson young," Vera continued, "but I had to relearn it after my career ended. Someone I encountered tested whether I really believed what I'd demonstrated. They tried to make me break. I chose restraint. Not because I was weak, but because breaking them would have broken something in myself too. And that choice ended up teaching someone a lesson they needed to learn." The audience applauded, and Vera gracefully accepted before introducing him. Our next speaker has a different perspective on transformation. He'll talk about learning hard lessons and choosing to grow from them. Please welcome Dmitry Kale. Dmitry walked on stage to applause that was more curious than welcoming, knowing many people recognized him from the viral video. He began with truth. "8 months ago, I was cruel to someone who showed me nothing but professionalism. I mocked her work, dismissed her strength, and used my power to try to make myself feel big by making her feel small. It was captured on video and went viral." The audience was silent, attentive. "I deserved everything that came after. But something else happened too. I had to confront why I'd behaved that way. What in me was so broken that hurting someone I'd never met felt like reasonable behavior?" He talked for 15 minutes about the journey from that moment to this one, the research that had revealed his spectacular misjudgment, the decision to help anonymously, the slow process of rebuilding. "I learned that real strength, the kind Ms. Solis demonstrated, requires more courage than dominance ever did. It's easy to hurt people when you have power. It's hard to absorb hurt without returning it. I'm still learning, still trying to embody lessons she taught me through restraint I didn't deserve." The applause was warmer than expected. But what mattered most was Vera, waiting at the side of the stage with an expression that might have been approval. "You did well," she said simply. "Told the truth without making yourself the victim." "I learned from the best," Dmitry replied. They stood together backstage, two people who'd collided in the worst possible way, and somehow managed to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Not friendship exactly. The history was too complicated. But mutual respect, hard-earned and genuine. "Where do we go from here?" Dmitry asked. Vera smiled slightly. "We keep going forward. You continue your programs, I continue my work. We both try to be examples of what it means to survive our worst moments and build something better." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you for learning the lesson, for taking what I showed you and actually applying it. A lot of people would have just paid some money and called it even. You chose to actually change. That matters." Then she was gone. Dmitry watched her go, feeling gratitude for a woman who demonstrated strength he'd never achieve, but could at least learn to recognize and respect. His phone buzzed with messages from Vincent about program expansion. His empire had transformed from territories and intimidation into something more meaningful. Networks of support, programs that helped people, commitments that required showing up. It wasn't the power he'd originally built, but it was power that let him sleep at night, that created something lasting. Dmitry left the conference center and walked into Atlanta sunlight that felt like promise. Somewhere in New Orleans, kids were training in gyms his programs funded. Somewhere, families were rebuilding after medical debt forgiveness. Somewhere, former athletes were pursuing education. And somewhere, a woman in a server's uniform had taught a powerful man the difference between strength and cruelty by absorbing his worst behavior and responding with grace he didn't deserve. That lesson had cost her job, dignity, peace. But it had bought something too: Transformation of someone who'd spent decades causing harm into someone who might eventually add more good than evil to the world's balance sheet. It wasn't redemption, but it was a direction. Dmitri pulled out his phone and called Vincent. I want to double the youth program funding and establish something new, training facilities specifically for kids aging out of foster care. Give them structure, purpose, skills. Can we make that happen? Yeah, boss, Vincent replied. I'm sure, Dmitri said. Someone once offered everything they had to scare away monsters. Turns out the biggest monster was me. This is how I learned to be something different. One program, one kid, one choice at a time. He walked toward his car, toward whatever came next, toward a future built on lessons learned from the strongest person he'd ever met. A woman who demonstrated that the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to fight when fighting was justified. That lesson had saved him. Now he'd spend whatever time he had left trying to pass it forward. 3 months after the Atlanta conference on an October morning in New Orleans, Vera stood in the training room at Tulane, working with a young soccer player recovering from ACL surgery. Through the window, she could see students crossing campus, heading toward futures they were still discovering. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Kale Foundation announces $50 million expansion of youth athletic programs nationwide. She opened the article, scanning quickly. Dmitri was quoted extensively, talking about second chances and responsibility. The programs were expanding to 20 cities, helping thousands of kids. At the bottom was a single line that made her pause. When asked what inspired his transformation, Kale credited someone who taught me that real power is restraint, and that the strongest thing you can do is choose mercy when cruelty is justified. Vera set her phone down, feeling warmth settle in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. That still felt too complicated. But acknowledgement that growth was real, that lessons could be learned, that people who demonstrated cruelty could sometimes evolve into people who demonstrated grace. She returned to her work, guiding the young athlete through exercises that would rebuild strength. It was patient work, celebrating small victories rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Much like rebuilding after loss, much like transforming from champion to student to mentor. Much like teaching a powerful man that strength came from composure rather than domination. Outside, the New Orleans sun painted everything in shades of gold, indifferent to human drama, but somehow blessing it anyway. The city continued its ancient rhythms, music and food and celebration, mixed with struggle and survival and the constant work of becoming better. And in 2 different places, 2 people who'd collided catastrophically were building lives that mattered, choosing every day to be proof that transformation was possible, that mistakes didn't have to be permanent, that the strongest response to cruelty was measured grace that left room for growth. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Real life didn't work that way. But it was real and honest. And maybe, in the end, that was more valuable than any perfect resolution could have been. Thank you for following this story of transformation and redemption. If you enjoyed this narrative, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories about the power of restraint, the possibility of change, and the strength it takes to admit you were wrong and choose to be better. Until next time, remember, real power isn't about domination. It's about knowing you could destroy and choosing to build instead.